So thank you everyone and welcome to the second session for the DMARC email authentication for better email security. My name is Shazad Mirza. I am the Director of Operations. And what we're going to talk about today and go into today is going to be the introduction to SPF and DKIM. So we're not going to go completely deep dive and get very technical into it. I mean, we're going to talk about the main aspects and enough of the aspects to help you get started with DMARC and get what you need to get and move along with the DMARC process and the DMARC journey of when it comes to SPF and DKIM. So the first thing that we're going to go ahead and talk about, and we're going to go jump right in because we have quite a lot of material to go through, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions. So the first item we're going to focus on is Sender Policy Framework, which is SPF. So now what does SPF do and what's the purpose of having SPF? So SPF is going to be an authorization mechanism that you're going to create and you're going to define, right? And what this is going to do is it's going to say that whatever systems are listed in this policy, those are the systems that are authorized to use your organization's domain name. So if that IP address or that domain or server name is not on this list, then it's supposed to be considered fraudulent, right? So in a sense, you're kind of whitelisting this. So, when you're creating this, so you're creating an allow list when you're creating this. In this allow list, you're saying that these are the mail servers and these are the only mail servers that are allowed to be used. So when SPF works and when it works on its own, right? So forget DMARC right now. So this is SPF as a standalone security mechanism that you're going to be implementing. What SPF checks for, it looks in the message header and looks specifically for the envelope from to determine what is the sending domain, right? So it's going to look at the envelope from or received from to determine that sending domain. So whatever domain is listed in there, that's what is going to be considered to and be used to check against the from address in the email. Now, when you're creating an SPF record, you're also doing this in DNS. Right, so there's no other special tool that you're using or special type of system. You're using your existing domain name server and you're creating a TXT record. So typically it's a TXT record that you're creating. So 99% of the time it's a TXT record. There may be an offshoot chance where you may have to create a CNAME record, but that's very rare. Typically it's just that TXT record. Now the key thing is when you're creating SPF and you're defining your SPF record, you can only have one SPF record per domain. Okay, you cannot have more than one. And so this is something you have to watch out for when you're going through and creating your SPF. There are some tools or some service providers that if you connect your DNS to them, they'll automatically create the SPF record for you. But the problem is that it doesn't add to the current one, it creates a new one. So you could end up having 2 or 3. And what you're going to be responsible for doing is making sure you merge all of those SPF records into one single record, right? Because you can only have one per domain. So what does this record look like? So when you're creating this record in DNS, right? So we mentioned this briefly last week. When you're creating a DNS record, typically you give it a name, right? But you don't have to give it a name, right? Because what it will do for the name is to actually use the domain itself as the name of the record. So when it comes to SPF, you're not giving it any specific name. You need to allow it to use your actual domain name. So depending on what type of system that you're using, you can leave that area blank. Or in some cases, they may ask you, okay, put an @ symbol in there because @ stands for null, and meaning by default, use the actual domain name. Right, and then you get to find a value, and that value is going to indicate how this policy is working. You can define what version you're using. You can now define what systems are allowed and which systems are, you can only define which systems are allowed. And then you can also define how messages from anything that's not on the list should be considered, right? So you realize what I'm saying is how it should be considered, not how to handle the message, but how those messages should be considered. Right, and when you're creating your SPF and DNS, it can be very complicated. I mean, it can it can actually grow fairly large. I've seen a lot of SPF policies that are actually quite large in terms of it, but you may have no choice in that depending on the situation or depending on how you have things set up and how you have things configured. Now, what are the tags that are defined in your SPF policy? So what are all these tags that are in here that we've already set up, and we've defined a few of them in that previous slide. So when you're creating an SPF and you're creating your SPF record for the values, it has to always start with V equals SPF1, right? That's a requirement. It has to start with this. It can't be at the end. It can't be in the middle, because this is what's defining that this is an SPF record. That this TXT record I'm creating is actually being used for SPF, and it defines the version of SPF being used. So the only version is SPF1. So there is no option in that sense. Now, these other ones that were these next few here are optional. It depends on what your situation is, on whether you need them or if you don't need them, right? So MX. So another type of record in DNS is called an MX record. And what MX stands for is mail exchangers, right? So that's basically your mail servers, the mail servers for your organization. It's the mail servers that you're defining in your DNS. Right, you may or may not have this, again, depending on the situation that you're in and how you're using things, right? Because in most cases, if you're using a cloud service provider, you might not have that MX record, even though majority of them are now asking you to create the MX record, because that MX record is going to define that, hey, these are my incoming mail servers, so these are the servers you need to send mail to. So if you do have those, and you most likely do, that you're most likely actually defining your mail exchanges for your organization, you add the tag MX. So that's going to say, so anything that, for my domain, if there's an MX record, those are the domains or IPs that are allowed. So domains meaning the servers. So those are the servers and IP addresses, depending on how you define the record. Those are the servers and IP addresses that are allowed to send mail using on my behalf. So that way you don't have to create, you don't have to create an entry for each and every single one of those. You just define MX and leave it at that. Then there's the A tag, right? So you put A tag colon and the domain or the server name that's going to be used. So the A tag you're going to use if there's anything other than the mail server, so anything other than the MX records that you own, right? So that's still part of your environment and authorized to send mail on your domain. So it's A colon, and it'd be again the domain name or the fully qualified domain name of the server that you're using within your organization, so internal to your organization. That's when the A tag should be used. Because there's also an include tag. So include, that is going to be used for third parties, right? So if you're using like Office 365, you're going to put in include colon spf.protection.outlook.com, or if you're using Google Workspace, you put underscore spf.google.com, right? So it's what include is going to have whatever the third-party vendor tells you to include in there. So include, so A is for internal, so don't, something within your own organization. Include, used for external domains. Now, there could also be situations where you may not have an actual fully qualified domain name, right? You may not have one. You may just have an IP address. So that's where you can use IPv4 or IPv6. So you can define that here, right? So it doesn't have to be just an IP address. It doesn't have to be just an IP address. If you have the CIDR notation for it, you can actually use CIDR notation here as well. Right, so that's where you're going to use, and you can use you can use the A tag, the include tag, IPv4 and IPv6 multiple times within your policy. Right, so if you have a third-party vendor, where you're going to have, if you have say 4 different third-party vendors, you'll probably have 4 of the include tags. Right, so you don't need just one include. You have include colon whatever for Google, include colon whatever for Salesforce, include colon whatever for MailChimp, and so on. There are going to be some issues and limitations here when you have too many domains. If you list too many domains, there's a problem. Right, so there's a question here, isn't there a limit on how big the SPF record can be? Yeah, there is actually. So most DNS servers will only allow 255 characters for your SPF. For really any DNS record, it only allows 255 characters. Some servers are actually allowing you to extend that a little bit more, but in some of those situations, if you have to go past 255, you can actually break the SPF record apart. So there's instructions and there's mechanisms that you can use to define how to say, okay, this is the end of it on this one, then go to the next one and go to the next one and so on. But you can also do other things like nested SPF and so on. We'll talk a little bit about those later. So another one in terms of the A, so if we use a mailing list server, should we use the A tag also? You can do that, yeah, for your own internal organization, that's fine as well. All right, so these are the main tags. So these are the tags that actually you see quite often, and these are the tags that you want to consider using. So V equals SPF1 is required. The other ones, depending on your situation, you can consider using them based on what your environment is and how your setup is. Now, there are other ones here. So as you can see, these don't always, depending, again, it depends on the situation, but it's very rare that I've seen a lot of these being actually used. So PTR is using the source IP's pointer record as a reverse map query. So a pointer record is where you're doing a reverse lookup, right? So you know the IP address and then you're using the IP address to find the domain. Right, this is something that I personally haven't seen, but it doesn't mean it hasn't been used. Then there's exists. So this means as long as there's a valid A record for that specified domain, it allows these messages to be considered as a pass. Right, so you can put in exist colon and then a domain name, and as long as the A record exists, then you're perfectly fine. Then there's redirect. So redirect is basically, and this, if you use redirect, you can only use redirect by itself. You can't add anything else, because what you're basically saying with redirect is, look, my SPF record is actually over here. So this domain, so typically it's pointing to a different domain. So you're gonna say that, hey, look, for my SPF record, code to this domain to look at what all my SPF values and what's allowed for my domain. And redirect is typically used when you use it because there are third-party vendors out there that will actually handle your SPFs for you. Right, they'll handle your SPF for you because there's a domain lookup limit, which we're going to talk about, and that domain lookup limit can get bypassed by using the redirect and using a third-party vendor to handle the SPF for you. So you can just point it to them. They'll tell you what to input. This is what you need to define, and then that's where you would actually go and do it, and everything is handled there. So but redirect is used by itself. EXP defines a DNS name whose TXT record text may be returned with any failure messages. So EXP is you're going to use it just to get some potentially additional information. You don't really see this used too often, and you don't really have anyone really sending in any information back. But if you do use it, it needs to be at the end of the policy. And there's also macro expressions you can use. Right, so if you're familiar with things like regex and things like that, there's some regex type commands similar to regex that you can actually use to define further things. So further information or further pointing to different items. Typically the micro expressions are used alongside with redirect. We've seen that quite often, but we're not going to get into the macro expressions in this session, really, because they're very complex. They can get very confusing. So you be very careful if you're using those. Or don't just go ahead get somebody to check them, to get someone to verify them for you before you actually implement it, because it could potentially break things and and cause some issues if it's not set up and used correctly. But we're not going to go into detail with those because that's another session in its own. Now another tag that is required for SPF to work, and this tag is always at the end. unless you're using that EXP tag. The EXP tag will actually go after the all tag. What the all tag is going to do, the all tag is going to define how fraudulent messages are to be considered, right? Not how to handle them, right? How they should be considered. So handling means that, hey, if this is a fraudulent message, this is what you do. These aren't not defining this. These are just defining that, hey, if this is a fraudulent message, this is what you need to consider the message as, and that's it. So there's 4 options here. So you have the dash all, which is a hard fail. So hard fail means that as long as it's on the list, then that's all that's allowed to send mail for the domain. Anything else is considered prohibited. So if it's on the list, it's considered a fail. If it's on the list, it's considered a pass. If it's not on the list, it's considered a fail. And that's it. The tilde all, which is a soft fail, and this tends to be the one that's recommended the most. So it's saying that if an email server is not on the policy, still accept the message, but mark the message as not compliant. So meaning that this is not compliant with that domain's policy. Right, that's what, and then most people recommend using the tilde because it's a safeguard, like it's a safety net, because maybe your SPF isn't 100% correct. We've seen, especially with third-party vendors, right? They may have some sort of issues sometimes where they're adding new servers and taking down new servers. So there's potential issues in that at that point. Right, so that's why tilde all is typically what's recommended. Most people tend to stay at tilde all, but if you can, try your best to get to the dash all. And again, if you can. There's a question mark all, so that basically says that explicitly that nothing can be said about the validity of any of the messages. So maybe it's right, maybe it's not right. It's, again, recommended, don't use the question mark all. Then there's a plus all, right? And this one should never ever be used because you're basically saying that any host can send mail on the domain. So it's kind of like on a firewall by putting that any rule. So people tend to forget about that any rule and tends to be at the bottom. So any means that anything's allowed in, anything's allowed out. So that's what basically you're saying with this is that any messages can be used. So you shouldn't use this. If you do use it, be very careful with it, because what most people will do is they'll use it to basically say, okay, well, let's quickly, we're working on our SPF policy. We don't want to remove it from DNS. Let's just make it a plus all. Just gonna get it fixed, get it adjusted to allow all messages to get through. Hopefully be marked as passed. But then once you're done with it, go back to the tilde and dash all. But do not stay at the plus all, because you're basically saying that anyone is allowed to use a domain name by doing that. All right, so it should either be the hard fail or the soft fail. If you can, try your best to use the hard fail, if you can. Now, what are some examples of the SPF record? So the value, so remember the name is going to be null, so either at or blank, or it'll be, which will automatically be the domain name. So some examples here. So v equals SPF1. So mx include :_SPF.google.com. So if you're using Google Workspace. If you're using Office 365, it's the second example. So include :protection.outlook.com. But if you're saying, again, if you want to use an IP, if there's an IP address for a server that you have, you can put the IP address in there. So by putting an IP4 : and then the IP address. So in this example, I use dash all for everything, but like Google typically recommends use tilde all. I think Microsoft does the same. They typically say just use tilde all. There's quite a few third parties that actually tell you to use tilde all, which is fine. But again, if you see on a continuous basis that everything seems to be working fine, there seems to be no issues, take into consideration using the dash all. So what do you need in order to do and work with SPF? So one, obviously you need access to your public DNS, right? Because that's where your SPF record is going to be stored, and that's where it's going to be, where you're going to go to make adjustments and changes to it. So whether you're the admin or there's somebody else who's the DNS admin and you have to go through change control, know your change control process and what the requirements are. right? Because if your change control is about 2 weeks, then you may want to make sure that your SPF, that record that you're going to create, is correct and it is accurate, because otherwise you have to wait 2 weeks to keep updating it. So try to get it right the first time if you can, and then submit it. Determine if MX records are being used. Very good chance that you actually are using MX records, so just put the MX records in there. And I believe there's a question that can you use the A tag for your MX MX or your mail servers? Yes, you can use the A tag, but if you use the A tag, do not use the MX tag, because now you're doing a double lookup, right? And when you're using SPF, and especially when it comes to domains, you want to limit the number of domains that appear in your SPF record, right? So if either use MX or use A, don't use both when it comes to your own mail servers. Yes, MX records are required to receive mail. Yes, that is correct. So that's why a majority of the people will have an MX record in place, and that's the only way that you're going to get mail. Typically, it's an attacker that doesn't have an MX record in place because they don't care about getting the mail. They just want to start a process or get information from you, or have you click on a link. To find out if you have any IP addresses or domains of systems sending on the organization's behalf, right? So, because again, if it's not in the MX record, so you find out if there's any other ones as well, right? Because maybe your dev team, if you have a development team, they might be using some test servers to send outgoing email. But you need to add that to the list, because if they're using your domain name, and they send the messages out, then those messages will get blocked, right? Or considered fraudulent from the receiving side. So make sure that those are added to your SPF. Find out your third parties, right? And even find out if your third party supports SPF, because not all vendors necessarily support SPF, right? And if they do support SPF, what do you need to add to your SPF record, right? What do you need to add to your SPF record, right? Because if you already have one in there, then you just need to add to it. You don't need to create another one. Remember, only one SPF per domain. If you have subdomains, can they have their own? Right? Can you have your own? Yes, you can have your own. Or sorry, they can have their own. So each subdomain can have their own SPF policy. Right? That's very possible, and you can do that. So there's a question about the MX. So if you're looking at Google, Google just tells you to use v equals SPF1 include : SPF.google.com tilde all the MX there. Yeah, my example has this, again, it's just an example of MX. I typically put the MX in there because when you create for Google Workspace, they actually tell you to create MX records, right? So they tell you to give MX records, and they have specific mail servers that are assigned to you, right? And those are typically servers that are the same across the board for everyone else, but they have you create those MX records. So I still put in MX, but I still include _SPF.google.com, because that _SPF.google.com can include other servers that are potentially being used other than the ones that they define for your MX, right? So I use it as a safety net, so you can put it that way. So that's why I have both in place. Because the same thing for Outlook, right? For Office 365, right? They have you create an MX record, but then they also say you should include the SPF.protection.outlook.com. Right, so there may be some overlap in that situation, but there's also additional IPs that could be being used, or additional servers when you're using SPF.google.com. It's like the calendar servers, or the Google Group servers. So they tend to have different servers in place rather than just specific mail ones just for you. Right, so coming back to here, so access to DNS, see if MX records are being used, which again, 99% of the chance they are being used. IP addresses or domains from other systems within your organization, your third-party vendors. And then the last thing that you need to take into account is SPF alignment. All right, so when you're using SPF by itself, we mentioned it's going to use the envelope from or recipient from, receiving from, to check the from address, compare it to there. But when it comes to DMARC, an alignment is going to be very important. Okay. So alignment is going to be, so the confirm SPF alignment is mainly for DMARC, not if you're using SPF standalone. SPF alignment is for DMARC because the way it works and how things are being checked, right? So when you're using SPF by itself, there's SPF and there's SPF verification, right? You as a sending organization creates the SPF record, then the receiving end has the SPF verification turned on and enabled, and that's what's going to be used to check SPF records on the receiving side. But when it comes to DMARC, DMARC is to say, okay, we need to check SPF, but this is what we're actually going to be checking from. So this information that I'm providing here and you're seeing on the slide is from the header information, right? So what you see here at the top is good SPF alignment. So this is, again, with DMARC is in play, right? Because you have the from address, and the from address is going to define the global, info at globalcyberalliance.org. The return path is saying info at globalcyberalliance.org, right? So these two match up. So based on DMARC, both of these are aligned at this point, right? Because the domains match. And then in this case, SPF is going to also pass because as the received SPF for this is the domain is info at globalcyberalliance.org. Is checking this to say, okay, what are the IP addresses associated with global or the domains associated with globalcyberalliance.org. So in this case, it checked the IPv6 address for Google, and it says, yes, everything matches up. Now, when it comes to SPF failed alignment, right? So again, we could with DMARC, in order for SPF to be considered aligned and passing, the domains in the from and the return path must be the same, or the envelope from must be the same, right? But here it's a fail. This is option here is a DMARC fail. Why? Because the from is globalcyberalliance.org, but the return path is a completely different domain. So because these two don't match, now DMARC is saying this is a failed unalignment because the domains do not match. But SPF is still going to pass. Why is SPF still going to pass? Because the domain that's being checked is the one in the return path or the envelope from, right? This is the domain, rsgsv.net, that's going to be checked to see what the SPF is for that domain. So when they check, so when mail servers and mail gateways check for this, they say, okay, this is the server I need to check. Here's a server. This is the IP address associated with it. So this is the return path. This is the server, the IP address, everything matches. So therefore SPF is passing. So this is a situation where SPF can pass, but DMARC is going to say, you know what? The domain alignment is wrong. So we're going to, for DMARC purposes, we're going to consider this a fail. Doesn't necessarily mean that the message will not go through, right? Because in order for DMARC to consider a message failed, right, SPF, DKIM, and alignment need to fail, right? Or SPF and DKIM both need to be failed. So if DKIM still passes along everything, then the message will still get through. Okay. So SPF alignment. So this is just from the reports. So this is why, just to reiterate this and stress why the reports are important, because in the reports is where you're going to see whether things are passing or aligning. So it's going to tell you this is failed. This is what we're seeing. So for DMARC, it failed unaligned SPF passed, and this is the domain that was being used. It only passed because this domain, the IP address was correct, or the information was correct. But the goal is you want DMARC to be fully aligned, you want everything to pass, and you want to see your domain in the SPF. Right, and SPF alignment is going to be a common thing when it comes to third-party vendors. And this is why last week we said when you're choosing between SPF and DKIM, which one is the one that you want to have DKIM in place, because you actually have more control over DKIM. Third-party vendors will work with DKIM better and be able to use your domain better when it comes to DKIM. Now, some shortfalls when it comes to SPF. So again, this is SPF standalone, right? Not using DKIM, not using DMARC. So SPF by itself. So one thing I said, remember, when it came to the SPF policy and you're creating it, you're defining how the messages are to be treated, right? How they're supposed to be considered, right? So if hard fail, it's marked as, if it's not on the list, it's considered fraudulent, right? Till the all or soft fail, mark it as non-compliant if it's not on the list. But then how is the actual message being handled? The actual message is being handled depending on how the recipient decides to handle it. So on the receiving end, they need to define whether they want to allow the messages, quarantine the messages, or reject the messages, right? They're the ones who have to make that decision. And most organizations don't want, or receiving side don't want to make that decision. So they may not have SPF verification turned on. There are a lot of people that do. I mean, there are still quite a few organizations that do enable SPF. And the problem they always run into is these messages are coming from a legitimate location. Everything looks fine. The links are fine. Everything is fine. So why is it failing? It's because the sending organization didn't have their SPF set up correctly. Right. So that ends up being the question is like, are you going to take the responsibility for another organization's SPF, or are you going to tell them and notify them, hey, look, because you could send back bounce back messages and say, hey, this failed our SPF check and, this is what's going on, depending on, your system and what kind of information your system returns back. So it's possible that could happen, but they may not send that back either, right? Because there is no reporting type mechanism, right? Because unless the receiving side sends some sort of bounce message information back, you're never going to know if it was rejected or bounced, or if somebody's going to say, well, I never got this message, it's not in my spam folder, right? And if used alone, if any other domain is using the same hosting provider, and this is typically with third-party providers, what's to prevent those other domains from using your domain if you're all using Google Workspace or if you're all using Office 365, right? And there's also a 10 domain lookup limit for SPF. So a lot of the questions we're asking about is there a lookup limit? Yes, there is. There's a 10 domain lookup limit, right? And typically they say, keep it under 10. So keep it to 9 if you can. Because when you get to 10, then 11, 12, 13, those domains can get ignored, right? And then their SPF automatically breaks at that point. And I'll talk in the next slide, I'll talk about some options that you have to try to bypass those 10 domain lookup. And then also remember what it validates against by default, right? The alignment does the envelope from and the header from, right? But sorry, yeah, so the alignment, yeah, it's the alignment. So when you're using DMARC, it's gonna be the header from on the envelope from. But if you're using SPF by itself, it's just gonna look at the envelope from domain and say, if based on this domain, that's what we're gonna be using. And that's what we're gonna look up and do a check against. Right, so that's a limitation on that because like people have asked, can it be spoofed? Yeah, there's a possibility it could be that the return path or envelope from could be spoofed. It's a possibility, yes. And then as long as that envelope from address has the correct SPF in place, it's going to always pass and always be considered a pass, which is going to create an issue when you're using the standalone. Right, and those could be fraudulent servers. So if they're fraudulent servers, they're always going to be passing at that point. So the 10 domain lookup workaround. So these are some options that you may have, right? So one is to do SPF flattening. So what you're basically doing in this case is using IP addresses instead of domain names. But be very careful when doing this, right? And what you really want to do is if you're going to use IP addresses instead of domain names, only use it for IP addresses that you control, right? That you have control over, right? Rather than putting an IP address for a third party. And the reason for that is because those third parties they can add and remove IP addresses as they choose, right? They stand up new servers. Those new servers will have different IPs, and they take down the old ones that have different, and they may not reuse those IP addresses, right? Then there's also situations where they may release those IP addresses and then somebody else takes control of that IP address. But you're not going to know any of that. They're not going to tell you that they're doing that, right? Because it's not their responsibility to tell you what IP addresses are coming up and what are coming down. They're going to tell you use include spf.google.com or _spf.google.com. That's what they're going to tell you to use. That's why they don't give you typically a list of IP addresses. Right, so if you're going to use IP addresses, only use it for your ones that you have control over. Otherwise, you're going to have some work, that you're going to have to do to actually maintain and make sure that list of IPs are actually correct if you're using third-party vendors. You can use something called dynamic SPF. So there are various DMARC vendors and some other email service providers that will actually maintain your SPF for you. So they actually have the back end. They use the macro expressions that I mentioned, and they'll use those to control your SPF. So that allows you to actually, by using these macro expressions and using things like this, they can actually bypass the 10 domain lookup, and you don't have to worry about that. As long as on the vendor side, you're defining that, yes, these are authorized systems and these are the things that you are actually using. So the other option also is, because this is something that people tend to fall under, is that they create the SPF record, but they only create it for the top level domain. And they actually have sub-level domains that are being used to send mail. Well, if that sub-level domain is the only one that's being used for Salesforce, don't put it at the top level. Put the SPF record at the subdomain level, right? Because not everyone in that domain is using Salesforce, right? Not every subdomain. So create a subdomain. So for your subdomain mail servers, you're going to have a separate records for that, for the MX records and so on. You can have a separate SPF record, so that can help as well. So that can reduce the number of domains in your top level SPF. So only use the ones that are needed for the subdomain in the subdomain, and don't use it at the top level domain. And then also avoid unnecessary include statements. Right? If it's not needed, or if you're not using that system anymore, remove it. Right? Get rid of it. And that tends to happen with third parties. A lot of people tend to play around with some tools and they put the include in there for it, but then they forget to remove it. So review your SPF every so often to say, okay, are we still using this tool? We're not. Okay, we're getting rid of it. We're moving it from our list. Right, so these are some of the options that you have when it comes to get around that 10 domain lookup workaround. Right, if you can use this, the best thing to do is to try to consolidate it, or consider using subdomains. Maybe consider you saying, okay, you know what, let's use a subdomain for this type of emails that we're sending out, so that way we can ease the load on the top level domain. Now, another thing to take into account, there's also something called SPF 2.0. Now, SPF 2.0, if you're reading about this and you see about that, that is not Sender Policy Framework. It's actually a different protocol that's in place, and that protocol is called Sender ID. This is something that's been considered obsolete, and it is completely independent at this point. So if you're still using it, or if you're considering using it, it's independent of SPF. So what we just talked about. I mean, it was intended to improve upon SPF, so SPF version 1, or V equals SPF 1, but it actually never really got traction or worked. And there are differences between the two in terms of what's being validated and how it's actually being used. Okay, so don't get that confused. They're two different things. They're independent of each other. So SPF 2.0, you're not going to use with DMARC, right? You're not going to use this when you're creating this SPF policy that we just talked about. Okay. All right, I see there's a lot of questions, but I'm going to keep going just for time's sake, because I know some people may have a time crunch for the hour, so I'm going to keep going. So next thing we're going to talk about is domain keys identified mail, so DKIM. So what is DKIM? So DKIM is going to be a digital signature that you're using as another layer of authentication for your messages, right? So just like SPF can be used standalone, D can be used standalone. DKIM does not require SPF, and SPF doesn't require DKIM. Okay, so this is another way to validate the identity of your domain by adding this in. Now, when you're using SPF, it's at the server level. Sorry, when you're using DKIM, it's at the server level, right? So this is something that has to be done on the server. The digital signatures are created at the servers, and that's where the signing is going to happen. So either at your mail server, or it could be at your email security gateway, depending on what you're using. Now, these can be TXT or CNAME records that you're creating on your DNS, and you're not restricted to just one. You can have multiple. And the reason you have multiple is because, again, if you use third-party vendors, each vendor is going to have or create their own policy. And typically it's going to be a CNAME record. So because they're going to manage the DKIM for you. They're just going to tell you, point to us, and we'll manage everything for you. So that's what you'll have. So you'll have multiple records for DKIM. All right, so minimum you'll have at least one per vendor, and then you'll have one for your own servers, maybe multiple ones for your own servers, depending on what you're using. So you can have more than record, that is allowed. So the way DKIM works, it is a PKI infrastructure. You do have a private key and a public key that's being used. And how are these keys generated? This is dependent on what you're using and what tools or service providers that you're actually using. Right? So if you're using external or if you're using internal, that's going to make a difference in how these are being generated. Right? So when it comes to DKIMs with third-party vendor mail providers and marketing systems, typically what they will do is they'll provide you with the public key. They'll tell you how to publish the public key. So if it's a TXT record, it will actually be the public key itself. If it's a CNAME record, they're going to tell you to point to this domain. And that behind that domain is the actual public key. Right? So like Google provides you with TXT. So they'll actually give you the public key, and you're publishing the public key in your DNS. Whereas Office 365, for example, they'll actually give you a CNAME. They'll actually give you 2 CNAME records that you need to create. I tell you that these are the 2 you need to create, and these are you need to point in. You're pointing to a different domain, and that's the domain that's handling your public key. And then the private key is typically held by that third-party vendor or the mail provider, and they don't give it to you. And then you can use that, depending on the systems you're using, some of them will allow you to rotate the keys as well, which is a good idea to do every so often. But the thing is so that's third party. So when you're using vendors, right, or third-party cloud providers. But what if you have your own servers? So what if you have your own mail gateways? So some mail gateways will actually allow you to create the private key and public key, right? So like Cisco Iron Ports, Mimecast, for example, are 2 that will actually create keys for you. They'll store the key on the private key on the server itself, and then they give you what the information you would need to do for the public key. So it will stay safe and secure. They'll lock it down on that system. That's what that private key is what's used to do the digital signatures. The public key is what you're publishing onto your public DNS. Right? You can always create your own keys. So there's a tool called Open DKIM that's available. You can always use that to create your public key and private keys, but then you have to have a tool that you can use to do the DKIM signing, right? Because something has to sign the messages. Open DKIM doesn't sign the messages. It works with other like Linux type mail servers. Open DKIM is built into some Linux mail servers. You just have to enable it to create the keys and generate the keys, and then you can use it to sign the messages for that mail system. Now for Microsoft Exchange. So if you're actually using an on-prem MS Exchange, so not the cloud, right? So the cloud Exchange, we're considering that Office 365, right? And so that's considered that third-party mail system or mail servers. But if you have your own on-prem Exchange servers, this is when you want to use something like a tool called like DKIM Exchange. It's free to use, open source, it's available on GitHub. There are other ones, but DKIM Exchange is the one that I've seen as being the most popular one, the most widely used one. But there are some other ones that you can use as well. What DKIM Exchange will actually do, it'll actually generate the keys for you, right? It'll ask you where to keep the private key, and you just have to find the location and make sure you restrict the access to it. And then it'll give you the public key information as a TXT record, right? And then it also actually has the capability of doing DKIM signing as long as you connect it to the right Exchange servers. So DKIM Exchange will actually need to be installed on each Exchange server. Even if you have a cluster of servers, you still need to install it on each one because each server is responsible for the signing of it, right? Because when you're in a cluster, you have 4 servers and each server is sending out mail. So you still have to install it on each server. There also is the option for, again, OpenSSL. You can do it that way as well, but then you still need to have something that's going to do the DKIM signing. So that's why, so it's typically best to use either if you have an email security gateway like an Iron Port or a Mimecast, do it there. If you have MX Exchange servers, you can install it directly on there. Now, if you do have Cisco Iron ports and Mimecast, and you have MX Exchange, right? Use the Mimecast or the Cisco Iron ports to do your DKIM. It's easier to manage it in one central location rather than doing it on each Exchange server independently. Now, how does a DKIM DNS TXT record look like? So again, when it comes to the names for DKIM, this will actually have a name. The name is going to have a selector. So the selector can be anything you want. It can be some unique name, then ._domain key, right? That's required. It has to have a selector ._domain key. That has to be the name. It's got to go in that order as well. And then the domain name should automatically be appended. And then the value, depending on what you're using, if it's a TXT record, this is something what the value could look like. So K equals defining what encryption mechanism being used, and P equals is the actual public key. So this is only part of it. There's other values that there are in there as well, but we're not going to go through each and every single value that's available for DKIM. So again, when you're creating the record name, it has to start with a selector. The selector can be anything that you want. In some cases, third-party vendors will say, no, this is what you have to use. So if the third-party vendor provides you with the DKIM information, use that. You cannot change it. You cannot modify it. You have to follow it according to what they provide to you. Other cases and other situations, they'll let you select the selector name. So like if you're using your own MXChange servers, if you're using the Iron ports and Mimecast, they'll ask you to define a selector name. And that can be, again, anything that you want. It could be Google, it could be a date, it could be a series of numbers or a series of letters, however you define. But just remember what the selector is for that particular server or for that particular system. And the underscore domain key comes after that. That is required. It has to be present. And then the domain comes after that. And again, depending on your situation, that's where the domain name will be added. And this is something we'll demo too next week. I'll show you how to define and create the SPF record. We'll show you how to create some of the DKIM keys as well. So if we're using a Windows machine, we'll pretend there's an Exchange server on there. I'll actually show you how to use DKIM Exchange to create everything and then put that into DNS. So DKIM tags, so two that are used there, K and P. There are other ones that are used as well. We're not going to go into that just for the time's sake. Those other ones, depending on the situation, you may or may not need them, but these are the two that you should at least have. So K, defining the key algorithm to use. So RSA is the one that I've seen the most, but there are other options as well. But then the P tag, if you're using TXT records, again, TXT records, you'll have the K tag or and the P tag, because the P tag is very important because that's the public key. You need to make sure when you're copying and pasting that public key from whatever tool you're using that you define it, that you copy it correctly. Make sure you have the full information, because if any bit of it is missing, then that public key is incorrect and those messages are not going to be authenticated. So the digital signatures are going to fail. Now, there are two sizes that you can use when you're creating public keys. So if you're using the TXTs, there's 1024, which is the most common size, and there's 2048. Why is 1024 the most common size? Because most DNS servers, somebody asked about this, what's the max size you can use for DNS? 255 characters. So 1024 just about will fit that. Whereas 2048 can go beyond the 255 characters. So be careful of that. Check with your DNS provider, check with your Windows DNS or Linux DNS to make sure that it supports 2048 before you actually use it. Because I have run into situations where with the cloud service providers, not all of them actually support 2048. So Bind and Windows DNS should now support it. I haven't seen any issues with that. The only time I've ever seen issues is with cloud service providers. So where if they don't accept 2048, you have to revert back and recreate it as a 1024. Right, so remember, this is all things that you're creating, right? So there's no certificate authority that you're connecting with. There's nothing or anything like that. You're creating all these DKIM keys within your own organization, or you're working with a third-party vendor, the third-party mail service provider, other ones are going to be creating it for you. So items needed for DKIM. So obviously, again, you need access to public DNS because that's where you're publishing either the CNAME record or the TXT and the public key is being there. Make sure you define your selector and you're aware of what that selector name is and what server or system that selector is associated with, right? Find out if you need to have a key generator and a signing tool, right? Are these two options built into the mail server or email security gateway? If they're not, do you need to use something like DKIM Exchange for your MS Exchange, which you do, right? But again, if you have like a Cisco Iron Port or a Mimecast, use that for your Exchange servers or for whatever systems you have internal to your organization. Find out if the third party supports DKIM. Majority of them do. There are a few that don't. I think like Shopify doesn't do DKIM, but they do SPF for whatever reason. But whatever they supply for DKIM, that is exactly how you put it into your DNS. So follow their instructions. I can't be clear about that enough. Because a lot of people try to create their own. They try to create their own, and for SPF, add their own include statement. Don't do that. Follow whatever the third party vendor tells you to do. That is what is correct and that is what is accurate. And now also, when it comes to DMARC, there's DKIM alignment, right? So DKIM can work on its own, and when DKIM was working on its own, what is being verified is the domain that's within the DKIM signature. That is what's going to be checked against when they do DKIM verification, right? But when you use DKIM alignment, that's where DMARC comes into play. And now DMARC is going to say, okay, let's check the domain of the DKIM signature, compare it to the from address and see if it matches, right? And in this case, if it matches, it's considered a DKIM aligned. So therefore, for DMARC purposes, it's considered a pass, right? So here you see in the message header, it's info@globalcyberalliance.org. In the DKIM signature, there's a tag called D equals. That's globalcyberalliance.org as well, so that everything is good. But if that domain was something else, and you see this most commonly with Office 365, it'll typically be the domain equals something like globalcyberalliance.onmicrosoft.com, but your from address is globalcyberalliance.org. That's unaligned, right? Because globalcyberalliance.microsoft.com is not the same thing as globalcyberalliance.org. So what you actually have to do is go into Office 365, figure out what the CNAME records you need to create the CNAME records, enable DKIM, and then it'll actually use globalcyberalliance.org. Right, and that's very important. So you want to make sure you get aligned, pass, in your domain in there. Otherwise, you get fail unaligned. It'll still pass because like mixsignup.com, when it looks up for that, the DKIM for that domain, it exists and says, oh, everything, it's matching, so we're good. But DMARC is going to say, no, it's not good because it's not actually using your domain name. And yes, you can have more than one DKIM record per domain. You will have more, you most likely will have more than one DKIM record for your domain. So some shortfalls. So one of the shortfalls is it doesn't define what to do if the signature is good or bad, right? There's nothing in there that says that. It just says check to see if it's authorized or not, or it's this authentication. It's up to, again, the receiving side to figure out what to do if the signature is bad or good, right? So obviously if it's good, they're gonna say, okay, go ahead and send it on through. If it's bad, they have to figure out, do we quarantine it? Do we reject it? What do we do with it? What if they didn't set up DKIM correctly? What if they forgot to set it up on their MailChimp servers or their HubSpot systems, right? They have to figure that out. The responsibility ends up being on the receiving side now. There is no built-in reporting mechanism for DKIM. So you're just hoping if they get a bounce back message, great, then you found out. But if not, there is no reporting mechanism by default for DKIM, right? It doesn't determine if the sending server is the one that's allowed to send that message or not, right? Because it's not, remember, what is DKIM checking? It's checking the signature domain, not the from domain, right? And then again, on the recipient side, they have to determine the authenticity on how to handle those messages if they fail the authentications or not. And that's why DMARC is going to be important, right? Because DMARC is going to say, hey, we use SPF and DKIM for authentication, so check both of these. Check to see what's going on, check my policy, and then act accordingly with SPF and DKIM, right? So it's going to say check both SPF and DKIM and see if both of them are going to pass. If they pass, great, right? If one fails, Will DKIM pass? Oh, okay, you know what, DKIM pass, okay, we're fine. But if both of them fail, things are unaligned, this is what you need to do. So now that way the receiving, you as a sender can tell the receiver what to do, rather than the receiver trying to figure it out. Right, and this also takes care of those issues with the same hosting provider, because they say use both of these. Check both SPF and DKIM, they both exist. Okay, now we made it more secure and safer because your DMARC is saying to actually utilize both of these. Then you have those reports. So those examples that I showed you, where it showed the pass, failed, unaligned, and so on, that was a DMARC report, right? So it's a DMARC reports will tell you what's going on with SPF and DKIM for those messages. So that's why the DMARC is going to be important again, because of that reporting mechanism that it provides to you. And then DMARC indicating what to do with the message if they were to fail or if they were to pass. All right, I know we have 2 minutes left, but I warned you in the beginning, if you start that, there's a good chance we're going to go over, because I knew there's going to be a lot of questions. So there are a lot of questions sitting there. But in case you can't stay, just as a reminder, the community forum is available. If you have any questions, feel free to post any questions there. The bootcamp resource page is available as well. That's where all the slide decks are. That's where the recording will be placed. Recording should be either there by the end of the week or by at least the latest on Monday prior. Next webinar is next week. So May 18th, 19th, and 20th. You do not, again, repeat, you do not need to attend all 3 of these sessions. Just attend one of the 3. You will be notified for all 3. Unfortunately, that's the way that our conferencing tool works, and how GoToWebinar works. Because once you register for at the beginning, you register for all the sessions. It automatically registers you for all the sessions. So only attend the one that pertains to the most to the organization. Because the first half, I'm going to talk about DMARC tags. We're going to take a DMARC policy and break it apart. And then I'm going to give a demo on the 18th for the Windows DNS, the 19th for Bind or Linux, and then May 20th on cloud. And I'm going to use Office 365 as my primary mail server to do all of this. You can and you are welcome to attend all 3. Right, but just remember, only one session. You got to make sure you attend the full session in order to get that certificate at the end. So if you want to attend the other ones later, maybe come halfway through, maybe wait 20, 30 minutes, and then you can join the last half. So the first half will all be the same. The second half is what's going to be different. All right, so let me go through and back to the questions. If you can stay, great. If you can't stay, thank you very much for attending. Look for the resources, look for the recording if you want to go through it, and ask any questions that you need at a later time. All right, so let's see, there are actually quite a lot of questions. So let's see. So it's too many lookups related to too many external entries. Yes, so that's that 10 domain lookup that we talked about. So you're restricted to 10 domains. The main thing about the 10 domain lookup is to prevent DDoS type of activity. Because the fear is that there could be SPF records that are just duplicate information, and then it just creates a loop that's not going to be good for you or or anything that you're trying to do. Can you link one SPF record to another SPF record? Yes, technically you could. You can create what they call nested SPF. They're not technically actual SPF records. What they call them is you put it like underscore SPF, or you actually give it a different name and then put values in there. And then you can use your SPF record to point to that. But the 10 domain lookup still counts in that case. So if you have domains in that other SPF record, that's going to still count towards your lookups. Where would you see non-compliant status? So there's nothing that's going to tell you. So what you can do is there's actually tools out there. So there are actually SPF checkers out there. You can actually, so what you can do is you just put in your domain name, and it will tell you whether your SPF is compliant or not. So DMARC has that, Valley Mail has that, Easy DMARC, and so on. There's quite all the vendors that are out there. They have, it's a free checker. You just go in there, pop it in. It'll tell you if it's compliant or not. It'll tell you if you're over the 10 domain lookup as well. For Google, can you input the IP address of the SPF record as well? You could, but it's not recommended, again, because Google tends to often change their IP addresses quite often. So it's really recommended don't do that with Google or really any third parties. So I believe my organization has obsolete SPF records that were created before my employment. Is there a way to determine if the SPF records are still needed? Really, the best way to do it is to go through SPF, and if there are third-party vendors in there, talk to your team and determine are we actually still using these tools. Unfortunately, that's the only way you could do it. I mean, I wouldn't say to look at the DMARC reports, because just because it doesn't show on the DMARC report, it could be 2 months later and now it'll pop up on the report, right? Because they could be using a third-party vendor for quarterly newsletters, right? So it's best thing to do is to create that asset inventory, check with your team, and make sure that you get everything set up incorrectly. Can someone spoof the return path? Yes, that could potentially happen. So that means you could have an issue with alignment, but SPF, yes. So you can still have an issue with alignment, and SPF will still can be considered pass. So that's going back to here, this slide right here. Yeah, right. And the thing is when you implement DMARC, DMARC is going to always consider anything that has a failed unaligned as not as a failure for DMARC. So you want to try your best to have aligned pass and SPF passing. But the thing is that, and you'll see this with third-party vendors. Like I see this quite often, like MailChimp and SendGrid, HubSpot as well. So something like this, the third-party CRMs. The SPF I see failing constantly. But that's why DKIM becomes important, because DKIM I've always seen let's say 99% of the time actually passes. Right? It's because you can define everything in there. It's defined to you and it's made unique for your domain. So if you have DKIM set up correctly and aligning, it should always pass and always use your domain. Then that's fine if SPF continues to fail. That's fine. You're okay. You can keep your DMARC. You can implement DMARC, and DMARC will pass as long as DKIM continues to pass as well. So that's why I say 99% of the time I've seen that situation with third-party vendors, but DKIM always seems to be accurate. We should be fine in that case. So it'd be recommended to use dedicated IPs for this instead of shared. With third-party vendors, you could always end up using shared. They're not going to give you dedicated IPs. If they do, you're paying for it typically. So with Google, Office 365, you don't have much of a choice. Like MailChimp and HubSpot, Salesforce, and so on, you don't really have much of a choice. So the 10 domain lookups, does it include the MX statement, and yes, it does. So any domains that appear in your SPF, those are all part of the 10 domain lookup. Right, so that's where you have to be careful. That's why, like somebody asked, like instead of using the MX record, can I use a : and put an IP address? Yeah, you could do that, or you could use IP4 and put the IP address there for your mail servers, and that reduces that lookup. How do you handle an external hosting web server sending email back internally to the organization that have the same email domain? So in those situations, the best thing to do, again, is like, again, when you have your SPF and your DKIM set up correctly for that servers, then you have your DMARC in place. Those external hosting web service provider that are, I'm assuming that in this case, you're asking if they're fraudulent, they're not being used, then at that point, they can send all the mail that they want using your domain name. It's not going to get through, unless the receiving side overrides your policy, but that's a completely different situation. Right, but if you have an external hosting web server and you want them to actually send mail, then you need to add it to your SPF. If DKIM can be set up, great. You do that as well, and then everything should work fine. So DKIM signer only needs to go on the sending email server. Yes, on the sending email server. But again, if it's your email, if you have an email gateway, you can just use the email gateway, and all your sending servers will go through your gateway. Then the gateway can do all the signing. Yeah, you did. So yeah, the DKIM signer is not on the, if I said something about the receiving side, I apologize. The receiving side is the verification tool. So DKIM verification to verify that the signature is authorized. So I have an on-prem Exchange, but send mail through Exchange Online Protection. Would I need DKIM on both on-prem servers and the EOP? No, you should only need it on the EOP, and it's fine. That's fine, but just confirm that. So that's where, again, with the reports that come in from DMARC, you can check that just to make sure that there's no oddity where that on-prem exchange server somehow is sending mail and not going through the Exchange Online Protection. So as long as Exchange Online Protection, you have that set up, and you have DKIM and everything set up correctly, you should be fine. Or something like best practice regarding replacing DKIM records, so like once a year or so. So if you were to look at the DKIM RFC, the DKIM RFC says that you should rotate the DKIM keys every 30, 60, 90 days. I think 30, 60 days, 90 days may actually be a little bit too much. What you really want to consider is that same things to take into account. If you have your own PKI infrastructure and you define your key rotations there, follow that policy. So if your policy is to do it every 30, 60, 90 days, then do so the same thing with the DKIM key. But at least do it at minimum once a year. Try your best to rotate those DKIM records if as you can. But just make sure you do it on an off hour or a time where you're not sending mail, because that can could potentially impact mail as well. DKIM is not encrypting into ciphertext or email messages, just signing each one, correct? Yes, it's just doing signatures, not doing any level of encryption of your message body, right? So it's like PGP, right? So PGP has the encryption part and also has a signature part. So it's the PGP signature part that's what's going on with DKIM, right? But the difference being is that also that for the PGP signature, you actually see it in the message body, whereas DKIM you're going to see in the header of the message. What is the TTL for DKIM and SPF records? I mean, I typically say just go with the default of your DNS provider. It's typically 1 hour, which is fine. So 1 hour is fine. If you will need it to go in immediately because you're making a change or you're rotating it, some people will change it to 5 minutes. So that way it makes the change quicker rather than having to wait an hour and cause potential issues. So how is DKIM verified when a third-party provided public key is published in DNS? So the way it's going to work is that again so what it'll do is in the DKIM signature. So let me go to the example here. So right here. So in the DKIM signature, what it's defining is the domain that's being checked against, but also defines the selector. That's why the selector is important. The S equals. So what it'll do is it'll say, okay, the DKIM signature is for Global Cyber Alliance. Okay, let's go to Global Cyber Alliance. We need to find the selector. We need to find the name. So GCA domain key .globalcyberalliance.org. It looks at that and then say, okay, here's in the signature, and the part that I deleted here was that the hash that's present. Check the hash against the public key. Oh wait. They're saying that this is actually at a different domain. Let's go to that domain and check the public key there and compare it there. So that's how it's going to happen. So SPF versus DKIM, when do we know what to use or which is preferred? DKIM is always going to be the preferred one, right? So DKIM is always the preferred one. If you can get your vendor to provide you with a DKIM key, that will definitely benefit you the most, because we've seen the most failures end up happening when people use just SPF, because a lot of third parties don't necessarily handle the SPF correctly and accurately, whereas DKIM, we've seen majority of the cases that actually does handle it appropriately and correctly. So I've set up a DKIM record and DMARC record for test domain, I believe set up correctly. The DMARC policy is currently set to none. I set up about 2 days ago. How long do I wait to get a report emailed about the traffic? Haven't seen one yet. Does the policy have something other than none? So by default, the DMARC policy says to send the reports in 24 hours within a 24-hour window. But this test domain, as long as you're sending out mail, you will get it. If you're not sending any mail yourself, you're basically waiting to see if some fraudulent type of activity is happening. And the chances of that happening with a test domain is going to be very rare. So what you want to do is send out a large amount of, not a large amount, but at least send out 10, 20 messages to a Gmail account or to a Yahoo account, not to an Office 365 or Hotmail account, because Microsoft does not send reports back. So send out messages, send out mail to a Google addresses, send it out to Yahoo addresses, and you should get some reports back. With centers like SendGrid, they recommend CNAME records for SPF and DKIM. With CNAME delegation of SPF, is it correct to say that SPF validation will pass as they maintain the SPF record at the CNAME address? And alignment will pass through the envelope sender and the mail equals to, it should, right? Because in most cases, if the vendor is giving you a CNAME record for SPF, so you don't have to add it to your SPF. I mean, they may say in your SPF, just include :sendgrid.net But yeah, they typically send it, just use this CNAME record and it should be fine. So SendGrid ends up being one of the ones that are a little bit better. If email goes through multiple hops, forwarders, then we end up with DMARC failures. Yes, because mail forwarders are not good for any type of authentication. So not just DMARC. So even if you use just SPF and DKIM by itself, good chance it's still going to fail. And DKIM is most likely the one that's going to still continue on with forwarders, because some forwarders actually preserve DKIM, whereas SPF and DMARC themselves will most likely fail. So it's really on those forwarders. So people who are using mail forwarders, they need to make sure they preserve DKIM, or they could use something like ARC. So ARC, Authenticated Received Chain, is another option that they can have. Let's see, so 3 more questions here. Let's see. So the original email sent from a domain A gets forwarded to domain B and then to C, then reaches D. In this case, DKIM fails. Is there a way to preserve the original DKIM signature of domain A? It depends on, again, what you're using. So most forwarding servers should be preserving DKIM. They shouldn't be an issue with DKIM. If that's there's nothing that you could typically do. This is really something that's going to only happen if you use, or if those third party, those people where the message are getting forwarded, they preserve it on their end. Unfortunately, it's not something you can control. It's going to be the responsibility of those forwarding systems to do what needs to be done. So even if DKIM passes, how will DKIM align when the third party sends an email on behalf of the domain? So when you set up DKIM with these third parties, what they'll actually do is they'll actually use your domain name now instead of using their own, right? So in the message headers where D equals, the D equals will be your domain, right? And that's why when you set up DKIM and you set up based on their instructions and their rules, so they're not going to use theirs anymore. They're going to use the domain that you're defining for your organization. So we allow our users to use vendors for marketing campaigns. The list is now long and we're having issues getting them to support DKIM SPF. Is there any way I can address these our domain senders so I can start working towards reject? Honestly, in that case, I mean, my recommendation would be if these users are using multiple vendors for marketing type campaigns, find one tool that can be used for all of them, because there's a good chance that they may be using different tools, but there's one tool that will satisfy all of their needs, right? Rather than having them use multiple ones. So plus that'd be cost effective for your organization just to use the one. So try to consolidate the list unless there's something that's one provides that's really outrageous or outside of what the other ones do. There's gonna, all the marketing tools really provide the same features and same capabilities. So the best thing to do is to use the one that fits everyone's needs. That way your list gets smaller. It's either that or the other option is use subdomains. Have all these users use different subdomains and then assign DKIM and SPF and DMARC to those subdomains. So someone looked up Global Cyber Alliance and why does it have an SPF error? It's actually because of the redirect. We actually are using a third-party vendor. We're redirecting our SPF to them. So typically when people are using redirects, the errors, it always shows an SPF error. That's what I've commonly seen, but our SPF is working. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sending out a lot of the mails and messages that we've been sending out. All right, so those are all the questions. We went 16 minutes over. I think that's the longest we've gone over at this point. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for those who have stayed overtime. Again, we have the 3 sessions next week. You only need to attend one of the 3 sessions. And again, thank you for all those that stayed late and listened to all the answers to the questions that were posted. And we'll see you at least at one of the sessions next week. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, or evening.